Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. There are a lot of organizations currently committing climate fraud in exchange for money, and the Union of Concerned Scientists is one of the worst. Their name makes them sound so sincere and intelligent. They're scientists, and they're concerned. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, "We live in an unscientific age in which almost all the buffeting of communications and television, words, books, and so on are unscientific. As a result, there is considerable amounts of intellectual tyranny in the name of science." Now let's look at the Union of Concerned Scientists' latest fraud. They're doing what all climate alarmists seem to be doing these days, trying to create fear, particularly fear among children, fear that they're going to burn up. The Union of Concerned Scientists, Science for a Healthy Planet and Safer World, July 22, 2019. UCS Extreme Heat Report, a call to action on Midwest clean energy. Excessively hot weather spread across the Great Plains and Midwest states last week. On Friday, Chicago faced heat indexes well above 110 degrees, and many other areas endured dangerous heat warnings and advisories. According to a sobering new report issued earlier this week by the Union of Concerned Scientists, the heat impacts of climate change will bring increasingly frequent extreme heat events such as these if we don't take aggressive action to mitigate global warming pollution. The report, Killer Heat in the United States, Climate Choices in the Future of Dangerously Hot Days, is scary news, but it's also a call to action. Clean energy is moving forward in the Midwest, and that's a good thing. By pursuing rapid emissions reductions, we can work to lessen the brunt of extreme heat we'll face in the years to come. What are the projected heat impacts in the Midwest? Here's some findings from the Killer Heat Report, focusing in on our region, assuming no action to limit global heat trapping emissions. The U.S. Midwest region, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Ohio, and Wisconsin, which has historically seen an average of 6 days with a heat index over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, is projected to see an average of 53 days per year with a heat index over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The region will also see 38 days per year with a heat index above 105 degrees Fahrenheit and 7 off-the-charts days per year by the end of the century. For Illinois specifically, there have historically been 34 days per year on average with a heat index above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This would increase to 80 days per year on average by mid-century and 107 days by century's end. The state has historically had 7 days per year on average with a heat index above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but this would increase to 43 days per year on average by mid-century and 69 by the century's end. The amount of fraud in this article is absolutely off scale, one of the worst I've ever seen. Their historical information is fraudulent and their projections are fraudulent, and they make them with such great authority. This is the kind of unscientific tyranny which Feynman was talking about. They call themselves the Union of Concerned Scientists, and then they rattle off a series of numbers which they simply pulled out from where the sun never shines. The message they're trying to send out here is that Midwesterners can somehow save themselves from this extreme heat in the future if they get rid of their cars and their fossil fuels and build windmills. This is complete nonsense. China and India are building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. The Midwest and the United States could drop off the face of the earth, and CO2 levels in the atmosphere will continue to rise exponentially. Now let's look at the numbers. This is the actual number of days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit reported at all Midwest U.S. Historical Climatology Network stations every year going back to 1895. I've separated it into two groups. The past 65 years are in blue, and more than 65 years ago is in red. As you can see, there's been a sharp drop-off in the number of 100-degree days in the Midwest over the past 65 years. And recent years have had almost none. Over the past 65 years, the Midwest has averaged about 16 days per year in which at least one station reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But from 1895 to 1954, the average was 36 days per year, so it's down more than 50% over the last 65 years. The article discussed Illinois specifically, so here's the same graph for Illinois. Over the past 65 years, Illinois has been averaging about 7 days per year over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But prior to 65 years ago, they averaged about 17 days per year. So the number of 100-degree days in Illinois is down more than 50%, and in the last few years they've had almost no 100-degree days. This graph is slightly different. It's the number of 100-degree readings at all Illinois stations for every year going back to 1895. So if 10 stations reported temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit on one day, they would all get counted in the total. As you can see in this graph, the frequency of 100-degree days in Illinois has plummeted over the last 65 years. Prior to 65 years ago, there used to be a lot more 100-degree days, particularly during the 1930s. This next graph shows the highest recorded temperature in Illinois for every year going back to 1895. Once again, you can see that Illinois was a lot hotter prior to 65 years ago. The hottest temperatures in Illinois are down more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1930s. That's a huge drop in temperature. And my graph correlates very closely with this map from the National Climate Assessment. The National Climate Assessment is mainstream climate science, and it shows a huge drop in peak temperatures in Illinois. So the Union of Concerned Scientists is simply lying. They're out of the mainstream. They have no idea what they're talking about. And this graph from the National Climate Assessment shows the same thing for the entire country. There's been a huge drop in the peak temperatures for the entire U.S. over the past 80 years. Now let's look at the average daily maximum temperature in the Midwest for every year going back to 1895. As you can see, there's been a huge drop in temperature, particularly over the last 80 years, with recent years being among the coolest on record in the Midwest. And the data I used to generate this graph is the official temperature record from the United States for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's the average of all daily maximum temperature records at all Midwest stations. It's a simple average. It's very simple mathematics, and I've released all of my software which I use to generate this graph. It's available for anyone to check out. This next graph is the average mean daily temperature at all Midwest stations. That's the average of the maximum and the minimum every day. You can see that mean temperatures are also down, particularly over the last 80 years. Now I'm going to show a series of graphs showing the frequency of warm and hot days at all Midwest stations going back to the beginning of the 20th century. As you can see, the percent of days above 80 degrees Fahrenheit has plummeted over the last century. Even worse for 85 degrees. 85-degree days are sharply down in the Midwest. 90-degree days are down even more in the Midwest. 90-degree days are much less common now than they were 100 years ago. 95-degree days are sharply down, and 100-degree days are sharply down too. The Midwest used to be a lot hotter, and it's gotten much cooler, with recent years being among the coolest on record. This next graph shows the date of the average first day over 80 degrees Fahrenheit at all Midwest stations. As you can see, the first warm day is coming later than it used to. And this graph shows the average last day over 80 degrees Fahrenheit at all Midwest stations. As you can see, the summer is ending much earlier than it used to. So summer is starting later and it's ending earlier. Summers in the Midwest are getting shorter. This next graph is the one which really exposes the Union of Concerned Scientists fraud. On the y-axis is the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and on the x-axis is CO2 concentration in the atmosphere increasing from left to right. This graph shows something amazing. As carbon dioxide has increased, the frequency of hot days in the Midwest has plummeted. The Union of Concerned Scientists is trying to tell people that if they give up their cars, their lifestyle, and their reliable fuel supply, they can save themselves from hot weather in the future. When in fact, as greenhouse gases have increased, the frequency of hot days has plummeted. Everything the Union of Concerned Scientists is saying is completely fraudulent. The worst heat wave in Illinois and the Midwest occurred in 1936. During that year, Harrisburg, Illinois had 46 days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's shown by the purple line here. The other colored dots are temperatures at all the other Illinois stations on the same dates. Illinois reached an unbelievable 114 degrees on July 14, 1936. In 1936, Illinois had almost 1,000 100-degree temperature readings, but since the year 2013, Illinois has had none. The depths of dishonesty by the so-called Union of Concerned Scientists is simply stunning. Now we're looking at an animation of every Illinois station which had at least 30 100-degree days per year. Let's look at the years when this occurred. 1954, 1936, 1936, 1901, 1936, 1936, 1936, 1913, 1936, 1930, 1936, 1934, 1913, 1936, 1901, 1936, 1934, 1936, 1934, 1930, 1936, 1936, 1936, 1954. No station in Illinois has recorded 30 or more 100-degree days in the last 65 years. 1901 was one of the heat wave years we were just looking at. Let's look at the New York Times headlines every day from June 29th through July 4th, 1901. June 29, 1901, heat brings death and much suffering. June 30th, 1901, New York wilts in protracted heat. July 1st, 1901, the city of Furnace virtually deserted. July 2nd, 1901, heat's holocaust in the 5 boroughs, 87 deaths and 178 prostrations. July 3rd, 1901, heat brings death to over 200 persons. July 4th, 1901, 200 more dead. Logan, Iowa had 19 consecutive days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in 1901, and they got up to a peak of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The Union of Concerned Scientists wants people to believe that if they build windmills, they won't have hot weather. This is complete nonsense. Now let's look at another July 4th heat wave. July 4th, 1911 was the hottest July 4th on record in the United States. Tuesday, July 4th, 1911, nation in throes of heat tide, temperature records broken at all points, suicides, deaths, and prostrations reported in many cities, thermometers burst. Here's the New York Times from July 4th, 1911. Crazed by heat, kills himself. Heat kills over 100 in country. Claims 10 victims in New York where the mercury goes up to 98. Many drop in street. The 1911 heat wave killed thousands of people in New England, but it was even worse in Europe. More than 40,000 people died in France during the 1911 heat wave. Now let's look at 1936, which was the most intense heat wave on record in the United States. This is an animation showing temperatures from July 7th to July 14th, 1936. Pink dots represent temperatures over 100 degrees. Red dots represent temperatures over 90 degrees. You can see the mind-blowing heat which was occurring all over, particularly the eastern half of the United States. Completely unprecedented. We never see anything like that anymore. Here's some headlines from 1936. Heat wave toll over 12,000 in 86 cities this week. Crop crisis worse. Heat rising to 119 degrees. 31 cities are over 100 degrees. Illinois highways blow up. July 16, 1936. Worst drought in history. Millions hit in America. Nation counts nearly 4,200 dead, but that wasn't the only thing going on in 1936. March 1936 brought some of the worst floods in U.S. history. United States floods, worst on record, quarter of USA affected, 1,000 lives lost, damage incalculable. April 17, 1936, third worst disaster, tornado in USA, over 500 dead. Block streets hamper rescue workers at Gainesville. February 14, 1936, intense cold breaks all records in America, worst in memory. And in Australia, they were having their worst drought in history. And terrific gales were lashing Europe and Britain. Yes, this is the beautiful low CO2 world which people like the Union of Concerned Scientists are spending huge amounts of money to scare children over. The behavior of the Union of Concerned Scientists is sickening, but even more sickening is what NASA and NOAA do to the U.S. temperature record. Instead of trying to understand the heat of the 1930s, they simply erase it because it doesn't fit into their carbon dioxide greenhouse gas theory. In 1998, NASA showed a sharp cooling trend after the 1930s in the U.S. They've turned it into a warming trend. They've come up with all kinds of great excuses to destroy U.S. history, but as we've seen, it was very hot in the 1930s and years prior to that, and it's gotten much cooler since then. Let's look at what's actually going on in Illinois and the Midwest. On January 31st this year, Illinois set their all-time coldest temperature of minus 39 degrees. This is what Chicago looked like during that record cold snap. And a year earlier was the coldest first week of the year on record in the Midwest and northeastern United States. I took this picture flying to Washington, D.C. on January 7th last year. That's Chicago looking pretty chilly. Temperatures were well below 0 Fahrenheit, and the air was dead calm. All these windmills were completely motionless. They weren't generating any electricity at all. Without the fossil fuels that were available to people in the Midwest, millions of people would have frozen to death. So what do climate experts want to do? They want to cool the earth down by dimming the sun. They want to spray pollutants into the atmosphere to reduce the amount of sunshine reaching the Earth's surface. So the Midwest is having record cold winters. They want to cut out the fossil fuel supply and make people dependent on solar energy. And at the same time, they want to blot out the sun. These people are completely insane. What they're doing is based on fake data, and their thought process is completely irrational and broken. These people are a threat to civilization. And anyone who calls them out on their junk science and tries to end this insanity gets dehumanized. We get called troll bots. After I pointed out Michael Mann's malfeasance the other day, he tweeted this. Many in these comment threads are fake identities created by corporate and state-sponsored, i.e. Russian troll farms. Others are just truly horrible people. Racism, misogyny, all-round maliciousness. People like Michael Mann and the Union of Concerned Scientists have no interest in the truth. They also have no sense of common decency. They take money and go around scaring children for a living. And then there's the press. Remember all those New York Times articles about horrific heat waves in 1901 and 1911? Well, look what the New York Times is saying now. It's not your imagination, summers are getting hotter. No, summers are getting much cooler. It shows that right in the National Climate Assessment. Once again, my views are the mainstream ones, and the ones being promoted by climate alarmists are extreme nonsense. Perhaps New York Times writers should actually read their own newspaper and read the National Climate Assessment and stop spewing such idiocy. President Eisenhower warned us about this in his farewell speech almost 60 years ago. He said, "The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite." So that's what we have going on here. We have people like Michael Mann and the Union of Concerned Scientists trying to seize control of policy with their lies. They refuse to have any debate, and then they attempt to dehumanize anyone who dares stand up against them. And they have the press corps nearly 100% co-opted into their coup. Most of the press corps refuses to ever publish any accurate information about climate. Our country and the world are facing dangerous times from these climate alarmists, and we all need to work together to shut them down. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.